Right. Am I all live? Good. Just to say, if you would like to catch up in the series that we're busy with at the moment, which, as you can see, is called 21st Century Disciples of Jesus, we do have all the sermons recorded. That's why I've got all this paraphernalia on. We do record our sermons every Sunday, and they are available on our website. And the theme that we've been following for a little while now is, what does it mean to be a 21st century disciple of Jesus? We recognize our lifestyles have changed quite radically compared to people who were living in the first century in Jesus' day. I think our lifestyles are very, very different. But we want to also be asking ourselves the question, so what does it look like to be a 21st century disciple of Jesus today? And so the focus for today is going to be on the miracles of Jesus. And there's a reason that I want to talk about that today, is because, the world we live in, we've got so much at our disposal, it almost seems as though miracles are unnecessary. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. When we read through the four Gospels, which are documented accounts of the life of Jesus, we'll see that over and over again, the miracles of Jesus are spoken about. And for the sake of what I'm talking about this morning, there's sort of three categories we can break all the miracles down into. The first would be the miracles of healing, where people were healed in different ways. People who were completely blind, they'd been born blind. People are healed. People who've got leprosy. Now remember, leprosy was incurable in those days. People were cured of leprosy. People who'd been lame from birth, they'd never walked a step in their life before, are healed. And then you've got somebody like Lazarus who dies, who's buried in the tomb. He is raised to life by Jesus. So that's the first kind, the miracles of healing. But then you've got miracles over nature. And you remember that there was a time when Jesus walked on water. And funnily enough, so did Peter for a little while. He had a few steps and then he got his eyes off onto other things and didn't find that was so good and worked too well. But that's what I call a miracle of nature. Imagine Jesus is in a boat in a storm, a raging storm on the Sea of Galilee, and all he does is stand and say, "Be still." And suddenly all of nature, I want you to think about that for a minute. All of nature, just one sentence, the seas calm down and there's quietness. And then you've got what I want to call the third category on miracles of provision. And a miracle of provision, remember when Jesus went to the wedding in Cana in Galilee, and they ran out of the wine. They were having a good time, and you might ask yourself, that's like quite a strange miracle to include in the Bible, Jesus turning water into wine. But what you need to remember in those days, culturally, that would have been a massive embarrassment for that married couple, because for the wine to run out for the rest of their lives, they would have been spoken about the couple at whose wedding the wine ran out. You would have been labeled for that because it was socially unacceptable for something like that to happen. And so there's a sense in Jesus, in what he does is turning water into wine, that we see him not only recognizing the need but caring for that couple at that wedding. And then, of course, you've got the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000. I was very tempted to do this morning, and I thought, let's not overdo it. I thought it would have been nice for me, because we're going to look at this a little bit later. We'll look at Jesus feeding the 5,000. I would have loved this morning just to bring sort of 5 little rolls that probably were about that size, little barley loaves. I wouldn't have done the fish thing because I don't know that you would have enjoyed that. But I thought it would have been nice to bring some little rolls and pass them around and say to each one of you, just assume you are hungry, take as much as you wanted, and let's see how far that gets. I doubt it would have got further than the first row. But here's Jesus, and he feeds 5,000 people. And for many 21st century believers who enjoy all the privileges of modern medicine. I mean, my daughter is a type 1 diabetic. And she's enjoyed the privileges of modern medicine. My daughter would not be alive today if it were not for the invention of insulin. if it was not for all of these gadgets that diabetics are able to wear to test their blood sugars and all of those kind of things. If you think of all the scientific inventions that are happening at the moment that we are privileged to enjoy. Isn't it also true that we're a generation who tend to first turn to the doctor, the psychologist, and the social worker when we've got a need? And I think the miracles of Jesus are a reminder that Christians are not only meant to be trusting God for ordinary things, they are also meant to be trusting God for extraordinary and supernatural things. And even though we're living in a postmodern, high-tech culture in this country, we are still meant to be trusting God for miracles. May I say this to you this morning? I believe miracles should be a normal part of the life of a Christian. It's almost like miracles have been put into a different category. That's something for unusual times. But I think they're meant to be a very normal part of a Christian's life. You know, if you go back to the first century and the believers who were living at that time, miracles were a very normal part of their lives. I mean, the first description we've got of the church is in Acts chapter 2, and it said, and God continued to do miracles amongst them. Imagine growing up in that environment. Just imagine it. It must be amazing. I mean, think about the fact that, Peter and John, as they regularly would have done, there were prayers at the temple 3 times a day, 9 o'clock, 12 o'clock, and 3 o'clock. And Peter and John are going up to the temple to pray one day, and as they're walking in, there's a beggar at the entrance of the temple. And I guess they'd walk past that beggar many times, and they have a sense of God saying to them, like, I want to heal this guy right now. And so Peter and John, they don't have any money on them, but they say, well, we've got something a little bit better for you. And they say, in the name of Jesus, rise up and walk. And what happens? And the Bible tells us that in Acts chapter 3. Peter said, silver or gold I do not have, but what I do have I give you in the name of Jesus. Rise up and walk. And guess what happened? He rose up and walked then and there. And there was quite a commotion in the temple because of what had happened. Miracles are also evidence of God's deep compassion for people. I think we need to realize that often when Jesus healed people and when he did miracles, it was because of his compassion. In fact, you'll read that in Matthew chapter 14. It says, when Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and he healed their sick. The miracles of Jesus were proof for people that Jesus is the Son of God. And as the Son of God, if they will believe in Jesus, they will receive eternal life. That's at the end of John's Gospel in chapter 20. These are written. When it says these, it's talking about all of the miracles that John writes about, that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Miracles are important because God uses them to demonstrate his power. And he uses them to draw people to himself. Now, one of the miracles that have been spoken about and have been coming up over and over again in the last sort of 2 months or so has been the feeding of the 5,000, which is what I want to talk about this morning. And because that's been coming up over and over again, today being Gift Sunday, I want to talk about that, and I want to talk about what we can learn from that and what I think God is saying to us as a church through this particular miracle this morning. So in John chapter 6, by the way, the feeding of the 5,000 you'll find in all 4 Gospels. But I'm going to look at John's account of it in chapter 6, and says, sometime after this, Jesus crossed. Sometime after this means after he healed the man at the pool of Bethesda. That's what it's referring to. If any of you wondering what it means after this. Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee. That's the Sea of Tiberias. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and he sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming towards him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a single bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up and said, "Here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go amongst so many?" And Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place. And so they sat down, and there were about 5,000 men that were there. So rough estimates, crowd was about 10 to 12,000 people. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, or we said grace, like we would call it saying grace, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. I want you to hear that. He didn't say you can each have a crumb because there's only 5 loaves and 2 fishes. As much as they wanted. And he did the same with the fish. And when they'd all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over, let nothing be wasted." And so they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. And after the people saw that sign that Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." And Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. Father, I just pray this morning, more than anything else, we would hear what you're saying to us. We'd hear the voice of the Spirit in our hearts and souls as we look into your word this morning. In Jesus' name, amen. I want to say 3 things about the miracles of Jesus from this particular account. And the first one is that the miracles of Jesus are a constant reminder to people like you and me, 21st century Christians, of what God is able to do. I want you to think about this for a minute. When Jesus asks Philip about buying some bread for about 10,000 people, Philip has got absolutely no clue about what's going to happen in the next few minutes. In fact, in verses 5 and 6, when Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming towards him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" And he asked this only to test him. And in that moment, the disciples were going to discover for themselves what Jesus is able to do with 5 loaves and 2 fishes, which was the food of poor people in those days. Philip's response tells us that at that moment when Jesus asks him, "How are we going to feed all of these people?" he is actually not even thinking about a miracle. He's thinking about how much money it's going to cost to feed all of these people. And probably it was way, way more than what they had in their money bag. You know, they carried around a money bag in those days. Then it says that Philip answered him, it would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for everyone to have a bite. Andrew, who is another one of Jesus' disciples, he goes on to say, actually, I found somebody who's got a little bit of food. And when he sees the amount of food, he says, this is going to be hopelessly inadequate to feed this crowd that are seated on the ground. And so this and I want us to be aware of this kind of sets the scene for what is about to happen. It sets the scene. Here's the scene. There's not enough money and there's not enough food. There's not enough money to buy, if we could. The food that we have is never going to be enough, or so it would seem. And the whole point that's being made over here is that what is about to happen is absolutely impossible. That's the point. This is not just a bit of a dialogue happening between Andrew and Stephen and Jesus. This is all about, I want you to see this is an impossible situation. You know, it's quite interesting that, I was doing some preparation for the sermon, how many people have tried to explain away this miracle. And what they've said is something like this. Well, Jesus said to his disciples, get the people to sit down on groups on the grass. That was a sign for them to all take out their lunch and start eating that they had with them. And you know, people have genuinely tried to debunk that miracle by saying people actually had food with them. And the whole thing is about a sign. And the sign was when you sit down and you can start eating, that was a sign for them to all take out their lunch and start eating. I don't know what you think about that, but I think it's a lot of baloney. You know, I want you to think about this. When we read about the miracles of Jesus, they are always put in the context of what was physically impossible. Always. Think about this. A woman who had an issue of blood for 12 years. She's been struggling. The Bible tells us no doctor has been able to help her. The Bible tells us she spent all of her money. In other words, no doctor, not enough money. I've spent everything. I've tried everything. Nothing's helping. And then she touches the hem of his garment and what? Bang. Did you see the impossibility, imagine 12 years, guys. Not 12 months, not 12 days, 12 years that she's been struggling. And she reaches out and touches the hem of his garment. Jesus meets up with a man who's been born blind. I want you to imagine this. Never, ever being able to see anything ever in your life. The impossibility of what's about to happen. And Jesus heals him and he's able to see perfectly for the first time ever in his life. Well, what about Lazarus? I don't know if you've read the story of Lazarus quite carefully. It says that Lazarus had been in the tomb. Do you remember how long he was in the tomb? 4 days. Just in case you thought he was in a coma. And you know, I want to add on to that because I was just thinking about this. Remember what happened while the ladies went to the tomb after Jesus was crucified? What were they going to do? They were going to embalm him. So in those days, because of the climate, you would embalm a body. Guess what had happened to Lazarus? He'd probably already been embalmed. Just in case you think he was in a bit of a swoon at that moment. I still want to see somebody who's been embalmed being in a coma. And yet Jesus comes and he says, Lazarus, come out. And Lazarus literally walks out of the tomb after 4 days there. When Jesus turns water into wine, it's that the wine had completely run out. It wasn't that there was a little bit left over there. It's completely run out. And in literally every account where a miracle takes place, we come to the conclusion that what happens is absolutely impossible without a divine intervention of God. I mean, I've told all of you the story about my friend who was a missionary. If you weren't here, I'll just briefly, I don't want to bore the people that have heard it before, but a friend of mine was a missionary in the Philippines, and his support hadn't come through, and they were out of money and they were out of food. And he said, Lord, help. Got to do something. And an idea came to him. He's going to look between the cushions on the sofa and see if whether 1 or 2 coins had dropped there, and he found some on the first day. Took all the cushions off, and the second day he found some, and the third day he found some, and the fourth day he found some, and the fifth day he found some. And then the 6th day, his money came through, and guess what? No more coins. Literally saw a miracle of provision. By the way, it's the only one I know of from a personal friend where there's something like that has happened, a miracle of provision. And I think as 21st century Christians, we need to be reminded that miracles like this still happen, because I think it's easy for us to become skeptical. I've met lots of Christians who are skeptical about miracles. Or, on the other hand, we no longer expect miracles to happen. I mean, I know we've prayed for miracles sometimes. We haven't seen too much happen. Then we sort of say, oh, well, maybe that's something we shouldn't be too focused on. I think one of the challenges for me when it's come to miracles is I've read a lot about that, and as I prayed for miracles for myself, for people, is it seems that there's almost God wants us to grow in faith when it comes to miracles. And so many people have just said, like, I've been praying and I've been praying and I've been trusting God for miracle, and like, seems to be such a long time and nothing has happened, and then one day there's been a breakthrough. And that's happened. So that's the first thing I want to say about miracles. The second is this, that these accounts of the miracles remind us to focus on what God is able to do in impossible situations. This is not about where there is something. This is about the impossibility. And you know, as the loaves and fishes begin to be multiplied as they are handed out by the disciples, they begin to become aware of the magnitude of what is happening. I mean, just think of 12,000 people, and you're going and you're giving, have as much as you like. Oh, have as much as you like. Have as much as you like. And it says Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted, and he did that with the fish as well. You know what they discovered in that moment? It's what we need to discover. We need to discover for ourselves, as they discovered for themselves, what Jesus is able to do with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. You see, here's the point. We need to discover. I know we know it in theory, but we need to discover it firsthand. That Jesus is able to take 5 little barley loaves, and he's able to feed 10 to 12,000 people with it. That's unbelievable. We need to discover for ourselves. Like the disciples there, their estimates about feeding these people were horribly wrong. You know why they were horribly wrong? They didn't factor Jesus in. Think about that. Jesus said, how are we going to feed these people? It's like, well, we don't have enough money. Andrew comes along, well, we've got this little bit of food, but that's never going to go anywhere. You know what they both did? They forgot to factor Jesus in. I think we often do that. We've got a situation before us, and we try all kinds of things, but we need to factor Jesus in. And these disciples discovered for themselves that when Jesus tells them to do something, they need to obey him. Do you remember what Jesus said? Get the crowds to sit down. That part's the easy part. In groups of about 50. Okay, so that would have taken a bit of organization. Imagine all the kids running around like our kids do here, and you're trying to get a bit of order, and you got them sitting down in groups, actually to make it practical and manageable. Then the tough part. Okay, guys, each come and get a barley loaf, or half a barley loaf, if you think of 12 of them. And there were 5, half of them, maybe some have got a bit of fish in their hand. Now you need to go to every single person or every group. I want you to say to every group, eat as much as you like. That's the hard part of what is happening. And I want to say this to you this morning. And I'm saying this in the light of the way that we tend to estimate and evaluate what we've got when God tells us to do something. There's got to come a time where you start factoring Jesus in, right? There's got to come a time where we've got to learn for ourselves what Jesus is able to do, but we're never going to learn the lesson until we step out in faith. I can preach this sermon to you 12 times. You would have heard the facts. You would have never discovered the reality for yourself. Now, there's a lovely little testimony of Canon J. John, which I'm going to show you now in a minute. And it's a story he tells about a man who was a missionary in Ireland, whose name was Mitch. And this missionary was a fireman. He was, should I say, was not a missionary, he was an evangelist. He was a fireman, and he felt God saying to him, like, I want you to stop your secular job, and I want you to do evangelism full-time. And his problem is he comes to Canon J. John and he says to him, like, Like, I've got a pension, I've got a monthly income, I've got kids to feed, I've got a mortgage. What about all of those things? And old J. John, being typical, just said, like, what's your problem? Just do what God says. So let's watch that.
I was leading a mission in Northern Ireland, and this evangelist in Ireland, he contacted me and he said, J. John, you're coming to Northern Ireland to do a mission. I'm an evangelist. Please, can I come and see you? So I thought, well, he's in Ireland. I'm going to be in. All right. I said, come to the hotel and we'll have a coffee. So he's at the hotel. I said, tell me your story. He says, well, I'm an evangelist, but I'm a fireman. And I said, okay, that's great. And he said, but I really feel God's telling me to stop being a fireman. I've been doing it for like 25 years and to go and be a full-time evangelist. I said, well, do it. He says, yeah, but listen, I've got a wife, I've got 2 small children, I've got a salary, I've got a pension. I said, what's the problem? I said, do what God's told you to do. He goes, yeah, but how am I going to fund myself to do that? I said, just do what Jesus told you to do. And I said, well, how much do you earn? So he tells me. I said, well, that means you only need 10 people to give you this amount of money, then you've got your year's salary. As I said that, I felt the Lord say to me, be the first person. Now, I know women think we men can't multitask. I'm talking to him and I'm talking to the Lord. I don't want to. I don't want to. I've just met him. I'm always giving money away. I'm always giving stuff away. I give stuff away all the time. I don't want to give him the money. But there's no point arguing with God. You'll be so unhappy. So I said, right, I'm going to be the first person to give you the money. I'll be the first 10th to give you the money. And he starts crying. And I said, if you don't become a full-time evangelist, you give it back to me. That man is called Mitch. He's called Mitch. He goes by one name, Mitch. He is the most influential evangelist in Northern Ireland, in Southern Ireland. He now employs 35 full-time people. It was me. I gave him the money. I got him going. Has God told you to do something and you haven't done it?
I must say, only he could get away with saying what he did. I think the point that's being made is when God speaks to us and it seems impossible, we've got to remember to factor Jesus into the equation. And for this evangelist, I don't want you to see it was about the money, it's about what God did eventually through him. That was the miracle, wasn't him getting enough money for his support. The miracle was that he ended up with a team of 35 people serving the Lord so people get to know Christ. That's the miracle that took place. And I want to say to you this morning, because sometimes we are quite apprehensive when God tells us to do something. Listen, if God tells you to pray for somebody, please go and pray for them. Stop saying, oh, am I going to get the words right? Because the focus has got to be on what God's going to do through the prayer, not on how well you can pray. You see, we always turn this thing around to us and what we're able to do. If God prompts you to give a word to somebody, go and do it because of what God wants to do in that person's life. This isn't about you. It's about what he wants to do in somebody's life. And this morning, I want to say, if God prompts you to take a step of faith in supporting the church financially, then do so because God's going to do something through that. I cannot wait for this morning. I've been so expectant about this morning because I want to see what God's going to do in our church through this. That's what I'm so excited about. And it seems to me the more we are willing to step out and trust God, the more miracles we start to see happening. Isn't that funny? Hebrews 11, without faith it's impossible to please God. And then the third thing I want to say about miracles, miracles make other people aware of the greatness of God. I don't know if you noticed in that passage we were reading, there was kind of a buzz that was going around after everybody had been fed. I mean, can you imagine? 12,000 people, like they knew what had just happened. There was such a buzz in that crowd. And in fact, in verse 14, it says, after the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, surely this is the prophet who has come into the world. And what we must realize, although miracles will not save people, they are part and parcel of our witness to people. They're one of the things that where God witnesses and shows his great strength and his ability to do the supernatural. And let me say that you might say, well, I haven't got a recent miracle account that's taken place in my life. Well, tell them about one from the Bible. Like it's almost like if it's in the Bible, that's too far away. It wasn't really a miracle. It's not relevant today. I think it's hugely relevant today. If you can't think of one, tell them a Bible story of a miracle. If you can, tell them a story at least of somebody else that you know who's had a miracle happen in their life. And if you can, tell them about a miracle that's happened in your life. Miracles remind us of just how much God cares about the many needs that people have got. Do you know that many of the miracles Jesus did, he just went up to people who were sick and he healed them. I want you to think about this. They weren't even Christians. But Jesus cares for people. I want you to think of verse 12. When they'd all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, gather the pieces that are left over, let nothing be wasted. Friends, let me say this to you this morning. Do you know the boy that gave up his lunch had enough lunch? Do you know the disciples that had been serving the crowd each had a basket full left over for them? Jesus didn't miss out anybody in what he did that day. Miracles come in all shapes and sizes. There are miracles of financial provision, healing from disease, someone getting wonderfully saved. Very good friend of mine in ministry, his dad was a really, really serious alcoholic. His friend's name was Keith. And I remember speaking to his dad, and his dad said, you know what the miracle is in my life? That God transformed alcohol into food and furniture in our family when I got saved. Miracles become more and more prolific when we are more intentional about expecting them to happen. And maybe just a challenge for all of us this morning, when we realize that we could be a lot more intentional about praying for miracles, and may I also say about testifying about miracles. You know, it's interesting to me is sometimes I wait years to hear of the way God has done a miracle for somebody, and you think like, why didn't you tell me at the time? I would have been so encouraged by that. And I'm sharing that with you this morning because I think some of us sitting here knowing of great miracles that are happening, but maybe we feel too embarrassed to stand up and say it, like we need to hear about it, guys. Miracles are not something that we've got a handle on. And I want to emphasize that this morning. Miracles are from God. They're in response to faith. They're at his discretion and in his time. I don't know if you ever remember reading in Acts chapter 12. There's a very interesting account there, which I think is important for today, that Herod puts James to death, one of the disciples. At the same time, he imprisons Peter, and the church starts to pray for Peter. And a miracle takes place. An angel comes in there, his chains fall off, the doors of the prison open, the gate to the city opens, and Peter is miraculously freed. In fact, in verse 11 of Acts 12, it says, Peter came to himself and said, I now know without a doubt that the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from Herod's clutches. Here's the point I want to make. With James, he was beheaded. Peter, miraculously saved from prison. If you don't see a lot of miracles happen, how about we start praying even more for them to happen? Simply because we know that miracles still happen. And I think there'll be occasions where we see an increase in miracles because we're being intentional and proactive about praying for them. I think you know that this is something that's very close to my heart, that we serve a God of miracles, and very often I've invited people to stand for prayer, for healing, and other needs in the life of the church. And I've done that over many, many years. It's not something new for me. And it's been amazing to me that I've had occasions where I've asked people to stand for prayer. Now, in a big church, there's so many people, you don't really know what's going on. People have stood for prayer. And I've prayed for healing, and it's like 3 weeks later, they say, John, you know what happened in the service? I said, no, tell me. That when I stood for prayer, I was healed instantly in the service. They're like, why are you waiting 3 weeks to come and tell me about it? Because God works like that. Now, I want to finish off this morning and ask this simple question. What can we take away from the account of the feeding of the 5,000 for ourselves? And there are 4 things I want to leave with you. First of all, don't discount what God is able to do in impossible situations. Let's not make it a last resort, asking God to intervene. Now, at our staff meeting on Wednesday, we were having a nice big discussion about miracles because I was going to talk about miracles this morning. And Emma shared a story, which I've asked her to share with you this morning, which I want you to hear it because this was a situation of something that happened to her, which was quite a crisis, and a doctor attended to her. And I want you to hear what happened there.
Okay, so this story happened before John and I were married, but we were in like a going out type of relationship, and it was in a season where a lot of our friends were starting to get married. So it actually happened at a wedding, and we had traveled down to the Eastern Cape in South Africa. We were living there at the time, and it was on a farm in a very rural area. We were about 3 to 4 hours away from any hospital. And so that's where it happened. It was the afternoon of the wedding, and it was extremely hot. It was about like going into the 40s. And I was, all dressed, my hair, everything done, makeup ready. John was like, all dressed up. And it was an area where most people on the farm, they speak Afrikaans. Now, I'm from South Africa, and my Afrikaans is terrible, okay? So I said to John, who is much better than me, I said, please can you ask the ladies in the kitchen there if they have some water, like cold water, because I'm like super hot, like I'm like sweating it out here. And so he asked them, and they just said to him there, over there. So he went to the fridge, he took the water bottle out, he poured me a glass of water, and he put it on the kitchen, big kitchen wooden table, put it there, and I picked this glass up, I took one sip, and immediately what happened was it wasn't water that I drank, it was actually hydrogen peroxide. And what happens is obviously a chemical reaction, and so it deoxygenated my whole system. So it basically sucked the air out of my lungs, and I swallowed it, so it went all the way down into my stomach. Literally in the exact second, I couldn't speak, and I couldn't breathe. And John was standing right next to me, and I grabbed hold of his arm, and he was like, what in the world is going on? Because he didn't realize or make any connection that what I drank, or that what I drank was the problem. And then I collapsed on the floor. And wasn't my finest moment, right, in my special wedding dress. But picture bubble bath, okay? Bubble bath started coming out of my mouth, and because it was reacting. It was a scientific reaction. I'm not into science, so you can look it up. But I started obviously vomiting over and over. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't speak. It had burnt my voice box. I couldn't say anything. In fact, the only word I could just about say, I just started going, Jesus, because I actually thought I was going to die. I really did. I was like, I don't even know what I've drunk. And I'd never had this type of thing happen in my life before. So long story short, John was obviously then trying to get help. I don't even know where he went. And the next thing, this guy arrived and he just started praying. He put his hand on my shoulder and he just started praying. And I remember him praying very specific things that the impact wouldn't affect my voice. Protection over my voice box, over my organs, like he was very specific. And then after a few minutes he said, I'm a doctor, I'm just going to work out what we're going to do here type of thing, don't panic. And at the wedding there, miraculously was one doctor, one pharmacist, and the two of them were obviously then quickly brought together. They worked out a plan, what they were going to do, treat me, take me to emergency, whatever. And so they were able to treat me. They had some certain medication on them. And so, yeah, that was a story of how I got poisoned with hydrogen peroxide. And also, yes, I was miraculously protected. I do believe that. I didn't have any lasting damage, no lasting symptoms. The biggest thing with that is it was diluted, right? So people use this type of thing on farms, but the dilution, if it had been like a fraction more, would have caused serious damage. The only thing I lost was my voice for an entire month. And it was a little journey there of trusting God that it would be completely restored. And yeah, so the hydrogen peroxide, just for all of your future, if you're ever out of farm, right, they do use it. They often do keep it in the fridge. And hydrogen peroxide, it's H2O2, right? It had been used, it was a water container it was in, and where they'd written it on, that second 2 had been rubbed off, so it said H2O. And so, yeah.
Thank you, Emma. You can keep the mic. I think what I wanted us to be aware of here, what was the first thing the doctor did? Do you get the point? That I was so interested that sometimes it's the last thing we do, and yet the very first thing that doctor did, I'm going to pray specifically over this. And well, we can all hear it. The prayer was answered. Eh? So that's the first thing I want to say. Secondly, it's as we hear about the miracles and as we read about the miracles that our faith increases. Do you know how easily doubt and unbelief can creep into our lives, even as Christians? Doubt and unbelief can so easily. Look at in Mark chapter 6, Jesus was in Nazareth, in his hometown. And he was with people who knew him. And it says he could not do any miracles there except lay his hands on a few sick people and healed them. He was amazed at their lack of faith. It wasn't though he couldn't do any miracles, but he was quite limited by the attitude and the hearts of people. I don't know how many of you are familiar with what's called healing rooms. Have any of you heard of what's called healing rooms? And they are places, venues where you can go for prayer, literally 24/7. And they've got a very, very specific way of doing that when you go there for prayer. Is that when you go there for prayer, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to start reading some of the miracles of Jesus before they even pray for you. Then you're going to read some testimonies or listen to some stories of how people have been miraculously healed. Then you're going to have a time of worship. After that, they'll pray for you. And I think they're realizing something about people, how easily unbelief and doubt creeps into our hearts and minds. And we've got to deal with that. And I think that's a regular thing we need to deal with in our lives as Christians. Number 3, miracles have got a much, much bigger purpose than simply meeting people's needs. You know, for us, the miracles, thank you, Lord, you've met my need. Do you know that the miracles are signposts pointing people to Jesus? Because he is the miracle worker and because of what he is able to do for them. And lastly, every 21st century disciple of Jesus has to learn for themselves that when God is in it, a little is a lot. We've got to learn that lesson for ourselves. Do you know that's something nobody can pass on to you? You've heard me talk now for, I don't know how long it has been, half an hour or so, about miracles. I cannot pass on my faith to you. You've got to develop your own. You've got to be obedient to Jesus, as I've been obedient to Jesus. We've got to discover what God's going to do in our lives, in our situation, what we choose to do, and the way we choose to respond to Him. In verse 13, so they gathered them and filled 12 basketfuls with the pieces of the 5 loaves left over by those who had eaten. Now, I share that with you this morning because we've sensed God has been speaking to us through these scriptures. God has been speaking to us at a time when we felt we don't have sufficient for our needs. And that's why we said we're going to set today aside as a gift Sunday, and because we want to see what God is going to do. Now, here's the most important thing that I want to share with you. And Emma, maybe you can give the kids a heads up and bring them back in. Here's the most important thing I want to share with you. We're going to be handing out some little forms for you to fill in this morning in response to Gift Sunday. And I want to challenge every single person. If you're a visitor here this morning, you're off the hook. So this is for us who see this as our place of worship. But for us to say before the Lord, this is what I'm able to trust God for this morning. It's not trying to twist your arm, make you bankrupt. It's this. This is what I'm going to trust God for myself. This is how I'm going to respond to God myself. And I don't know your circumstances, but God does. And the challenge is, will we be those who say, Lord, I'm willing to respond?